It started with a seemingly harmless gift. A DNA testing kit, one of those trendy ones you see advertised all over the internet. My wife, Lena, had bought it as part of a sale, a family bonding activity, she called it. She was always into quirky ideas like that, painting nights, game nights, and now genealogy nights. She thought it would be fun for us and our 6-year-old son, Ethan, to explore our roots. At first, I was skeptical. My heritage had never been a mystery. Both my parents were proud of our family's Irish roots, and I'd heard the same stories about my great-grandparents' immigration countless times. But Lena's enthusiasm was infectious, and Ethan seemed genuinely excited. So, I swabbed my cheek and sent off the kit, figuring it would be a nice distraction from the monotony of everyday life. Weeks went by, and I forgot about the test entirely. Life carried on as usual. Work, school drop-offs, dinners, and lazy weekends. Lena's job as a graphic designer kept her busy, and I was swamped with a new project at my engineering firm. Ethan was the glue holding us together, his boundless energy and curious nature a constant source of joy. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Beneath it, though, there were cracks I hadn't yet noticed. One afternoon, an email from the DNA testing company popped into my inbox. I opened it out of curiosity, expecting little more than a confirmation of my Irish heritage and perhaps a few distant cousins I'd never meet. The initial results were just that, a breakdown of my ancestry with no surprises. But then I noticed the section labeled relatives. The service had identified a few matches, including third and fourth cousins, none of whom I recognized. I scrolled further, looking for Ethan's name, which should have appeared as a parent-child match. It wasn't there. My stomach dropped. I checked again, refreshing the page, thinking it was some sort of error. But the results were clear. Ethan's DNA was not linked to mine. At first, I told myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe the samples had been swapped or there was a mix-up at the lab. But the more I read about the accuracy of the tests, the harder it became to cling to that hope. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. If Ethan wasn't biologically mine, then what did that mean? Was there a simple explanation, or was it something far more devastating? I didn't confront Lena immediately. Instead, I decided to retake the test. I ordered a second kit, being meticulous with the process this time, ensuring there was no room for error. The waiting period felt like an eternity. Every day, I went through the motions of life with a growing knot in my stomach, analyzing every interaction with Lena for signs I might have missed. She didn't seem any different, which only made things more confusing. She was attentive and loving, the same woman I had married 8 years ago. We laughed together, shared quiet moments after Ethan went to bed, and made plans for the future. How could she act so normal if she had been hiding something so monumental? The second set of results arrived, and they confirmed my worst fears. Ethan wasn't my biological son. The data was indisputable. My world shattered in an instant. The revelation triggered a flood of memories I had never questioned before. Ethan's birth had been uneventful, at least from my perspective. Lena had gone into labor a week early, and everything had happened so quickly that I hadn't had time to process much. When I held Ethan for the first time, I was overwhelmed with love, not once questioning that he was mine. As Ethan grew, people often commented on how much he looked like Lena. "He has her eyes," they'd say. "Her smile, too." I'd always laughed it off, proud that our son had inherited her best traits. Now, those comments felt like daggers, each one a reminder of the truth I had been too blind to see. I began to scrutinize the timeline of Lena's pregnancy. She had been working long hours at the time, often staying late at the office to finish a big project. I had trusted her implicitly, never questioning her explanations. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and the clarity of betrayal, I saw those late nights in a new light. Determined to uncover the truth, I started looking into Lena's life during that period. I went through old photos, emails, and messages, searching for anything that might hint at infidelity. Felt invasive and wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed answers. One night, while Lena and Ethan were asleep, I found an email thread buried deep in her archives. It was between her and a man named Daniel, someone I didn't recognize. The messages were casual at first, discussing work-related matters, but they gradually became more personal. They joked about inside office politics, shared anecdotes about their lives, and complimented each other in ways that felt too familiar for colleagues. One message stood out. "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you." It was dated 9 months before Ethan was born. My hands shook as I read the words, the implications crashing over me like a tidal wave. Daniel wasn't just a colleague. He was the man who had fathered my son. Armed with this new information, I faced a choice: confront Lena or continue digging until I had irrefutable proof. Part of me wanted to believe there was some explanation, that maybe I was misinterpreting things. But deep down, I knew the truth. Lena had betrayed me, and the life we had built together was built on a lie. Ethan was still my son in every way that mattered, but I couldn't ignore the deception at the heart of our family. The love I felt for him was real, but it was now tangled with the bitter knowledge of how he had come to be. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that my life would never be the same. The facade of perfection had been shattered, and there was no going back. The only question that remained was what I would do with the truth. The days after I discovered the emails were some of the hardest I've ever endured. It felt like I was walking through a fog, each step weighted down by the burden of knowledge. I couldn't look at Lena without seeing the emails, without hearing Daniel's name echoing in my head. Every shared laugh, every casual touch, every "I love you" now felt hollow, as though the foundation of my life had crumbled beneath me. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself forever. The secret was a poison, slowly eating away at me. But every time I thought about confronting Lena, a wave of dread washed over me. What if she denied everything? Worse, what if she admitted it? How would I handle the truth, spoken aloud and confirmed by the very person I trusted most? Ethan was the only thing keeping me grounded. His innocence in all of this was a constant reminder that, no matter what happened between Lena and me, he deserved to be loved and protected. He was my son, even if not by blood. That much I knew with certainty. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, I decided it was time. Lena was in the kitchen, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled when I walked in, but her expression shifted when she saw the seriousness on my face. I sat across from her, my hands gripping the edge of the table as though it might anchor me. I started by mentioning the DNA test, framing it as a curious anomaly I wanted to discuss. Her brow furrowed, and she tilted her head, clearly puzzled. When I told her the results showed that Ethan wasn't biologically mine, her confusion turned to shock. She stammered, asking if there had been a mistake, insisting that the tests weren't always accurate. That's when I brought up the second test. The color drained from her face as I explained that I had retaken the test to confirm the results. There was no error, no lab mix-up. Ethan wasn't my son, and I needed to know why. Lena's hands trembled as she set down her tea. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. She said she didn't know what I was talking about, that there had to be some logical explanation. But her eyes betrayed her, darting around the room as though searching for an escape. I took a deep breath and told her about the emails. Her denial faltered, and she froze. When I mentioned Daniel by name, tears welled in her eyes. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that stretches endlessly and suffocates you with its weight. Eventually, she spoke. Her words came out in halting fragments, each one heavier than the last. She admitted to the affair, explaining that it had started during a particularly stressful time at work. Daniel had been a new hire, charming and attentive in a way she hadn't realized she craved. What began as harmless flirtation had escalated, culminating in a short-lived affair that she claimed had ended before she found out she was pregnant. She insisted she hadn't known Ethan wasn't mine. She said she'd never considered the possibility because she hadn't been with Daniel long enough for it to cross her mind. Her tears fell freely now, and she begged me to believe that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. Her words felt like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. I wanted to yell, to demand answers to the questions swirling in my mind. But I also felt numb, as though the enormity of the betrayal had short-circuited my ability to react. In the days that followed, Lena tried to repair the damage. She apologized endlessly, promising transparency and offering to do whatever it took to regain my trust. She even suggested marriage counseling, saying she was willing to fight for us if I was. But I couldn't shake the image of her with Daniel, the knowledge that she had lied to me for years. Every time I looked at her, I saw the emails, the forged timeline, the betrayal. I started sleeping in the guest room, unable to share the same space with her. The house, once warm and filled with laughter, now felt like a prison. Ethan, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him, became my lifeline. I poured all my energy into him, cherishing every moment we spent together. He was my son in every way that mattered, and I refused to let Lena's choices change that. One question continued to nag at me. Had Lena truly not known Ethan wasn't mine, or was that just another lie? I decided to find out for myself. I contacted Daniel using the email thread I had discovered to track him down. It was a risky move, one that felt equal parts desperate and necessary. Daniel responded quickly, agreeing to meet in person. When we sat across from each other at a small cafe, I was struck by how ordinary he looked. This was the man who had upended my life, and yet he seemed so unremarkable. The anger I'd felt toward him was overshadowed by my need for answers. Daniel was candid, his demeanor surprisingly apologetic. He admitted to the affair, acknowledging that it had been a mistake. But when I asked if he had known about Ethan, he looked genuinely surprised. He claimed Lena had never told him she was pregnant, and he'd had no idea Ethan existed. His reaction seemed sincere, but I couldn't be sure if he was telling the truth or protecting himself. When I pressed further, asking if he'd be willing to take a paternity test, he agreed without hesitation. His willingness to cooperate was unexpected, and it planted a seed of doubt in my mind. What if Lena had lied to both of us? What if she had known all along and chosen to keep the truth from everyone? The test confirmed what I already suspected. Daniel was Ethan's biological father. When I shared the results with him, his face betrayed a mixture of shock and guilt. He asked about Ethan, about what kind of boy he was, about whether he could meet him someday. The request made my stomach turn. Ethan was my son, not his, and the thought of Daniel inserting himself into our lives was unbearable. I left the meeting feeling more conflicted than ever. The truth had brought no relief, only more questions. What did this mean for Ethan's future? For mine? And how could I protect him from the fallout of choices he had no part in making? The days following my meeting with Daniel felt surreal. I now had the truth, yet it offered no solace. Knowing he was Ethan's biological father didn't change my feelings for my son, but it deepened the chasm between Lena and me. Her betrayal wasn't just a momentary lapse. It was a decision that had rippled through every aspect of our lives. The knowledge weighed on me, a constant reminder that the life I thought I had was built on lies. Lena's attempts to mend our relationship became more desperate. She tried to initiate conversations, suggesting therapy and apologizing again and again. But her words felt empty, like they were coming from someone I no longer recognized. I began avoiding her, leaving for work earlier and staying out later, finding excuses to keep myself busy. At home, the tension was palpable, the air heavy with everything left unsaid. Ethan, blissfully unaware of the turmoil, continued to be the light in my life. His laughter and curiosity were a welcome distraction, but even those moments of joy were tinged with sadness. Every time I looked at him, I felt the weight of the truth. He wasn't mine by blood, and yet he was mine in every way that mattered. I vowed to shield him from the fallout no matter what it cost me. One afternoon, while working late at the office, I received an unexpected call from Daniel. His voice was tentative as he asked if we could meet again. Reluctantly, I agreed. We met at the same cafe, and this time he came prepared with questions about Ethan. What was he like? What were his favorite activities? Did he know the truth? His curiosity unsettled me. He seemed genuine, but his interest in Ethan felt invasive. I made it clear that Ethan was my son, and that I wasn't prepared to disrupt his life by introducing Daniel into the picture. To my surprise, Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he apologized for the pain he had caused and promised to respect my wishes. Still, I left the meeting feeling uneasy. His willingness to back off didn't erase the possibility that he might change his mind. One evening, As I sat in the guest room sorting through old photos, Lena knocked on the door. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red. She held a notebook in her hands, her fingers trembling as she clutched it. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Reluctantly, I let her in. She handed me the notebook, explaining that it was a journal she had kept during the time of her affair with Daniel. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to delve into the details of her betrayal. But curiosity and the hope for closure drove me to open it. The entries painted a picture of a woman struggling with her insecurities and seeking validation in all the wrong places. She wrote about how she had felt neglected during my long work hours, how Daniel had made her feel seen and appreciated. But as the entries progressed, her tone shifted. She expressed guilt and regret, writing about how she realized the affair was a mistake and how much she feared losing me. Her final entries were written after Ethan's birth. She described the overwhelming love she felt for him and her decision to bury the past, convincing herself that the affair was a secret she could take to her grave. Reading her words stirred a mix of emotions in me: anger, sadness, and a sliver of understanding. But it wasn't enough to erase the damage that had been done. Amidst the chaos, Ethan became my sole focus. I threw myself into being the best father I could be, attending his school events, helping with homework, and taking him on weekend adventures. He was my anchor, the one thing that kept me from spiraling into despair. One evening, as we played a board game, Ethan looked up at me with his bright, inquisitive eyes. "Dad, why don't you and Mom talk anymore?" he asked. His question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements," I said carefully. "But no matter what, I love you more than anything." He seemed satisfied with that answer, but his question lingered in my mind. How long could I keep the truth from him? And when the time came, how would I explain the complexities of our situation without shattering his world? As the weeks turned into months, I began to realize that the current state of limbo was unsustainable. Lena and I were coexisting, but we were far from being a family. The house felt like a battlefield, each interaction a skirmish in a war neither of us wanted to fight. Something had to change. One evening, after Ethan was asleep, I asked Lena to sit down with me. I told her that while I appreciated her efforts to make amends, I couldn't see a way forward for us. The trust that had been the foundation of our relationship was gone, and no amount of therapy or apologies could rebuild it. She nodded silently, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time, I saw acceptance in her eyes. We agreed to separate, prioritizing Ethan's well-being above all else. We would share custody and maintain a cordial relationship for his sake. The decision was painful, but it also felt like a weight had been lifted. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity. Moving out of the house was bittersweet. I found a small apartment nearby, ensuring I could still be close to Ethan. The process of starting over was daunting, but it was also liberating. I began to focus on myself, rediscovering hobbies and reconnecting with friends I had drifted away from during my marriage. Lena and I maintained a polite but distant relationship, communicating only about matters concerning Ethan. She seemed to be making an effort to rebuild her life as well, and while I couldn't forgive her completely, I wished her no ill will. Just as I was beginning to find my footing, I received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a letter from Daniel. He wrote that he had been reflecting on our conversations and wanted to apologize again for his role in the situation. But what struck me most was his final request. He wanted to meet Ethan, not as a father, but as someone who cared about his well-being. The letter reignited all the doubts and fears I had tried to suppress. Allowing Daniel into Ethan's life could complicate everything, but denying him the opportunity felt equally wrong. I was torn, unsure of how to proceed. As I stared at the letter, I realized that the choices I made now would shape not only my future but Ethan's as well. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I had to navigate it with honesty, courage, and an unwavering commitment to my son. The arrival of Daniel's letter disrupted the fragile equilibrium I had painstakingly built. It was as if the past refused to stay buried, clawing its way back into my life when I was finally beginning to move forward. For days, the envelope sat unopened on my desk, its contents an unspoken challenge I wasn't ready to confront. When I finally mustered the courage to read it, the words hit me like a freight train. Daniel's tone was sincere, almost apologetic. He acknowledged the pain his actions had caused and emphasized that he had no intention of disrupting Ethan's life. But his request was clear. He wanted to meet his biological son. Not as a father, he claimed, but as someone who had come to care deeply about the boy he'd unknowingly brought into the world. He left the decision entirely in my hands, assuring me that he would respect whatever choice I made. The letter reopened old wounds. Ethan was my son in every way that mattered, but Daniel's request forced me to confront questions I'd been avoiding. Did Ethan have a right to know about his biological father? Would meeting Daniel help or harm him? And what would it mean for my role in Ethan's life? Unsure of how to proceed, I turned to therapy once again. My sessions became a space to unpack the turmoil swirling in my mind. My therapist encouraged me to consider Ethan's needs above all else, to think about how the truth might affect him both now and in the future. She reminded me that children are resilient but also deeply intuitive. If I chose to keep Daniel's existence a secret, there was always the risk that Ethan would discover it later and feel betrayed. I also sought advice from Daniel. Despite my lingering resentment, I couldn't ignore his perspective. We met at a neutral location, and I laid out my concerns. To my surprise, he seemed more interested in doing what was best for Ethan than in asserting his own desires. He suggested that if Ethan were to learn the truth, it should come from me, someone he trusted implicitly. Daniel's willingness to step back eased some of my fears, but it didn't make the decision any easier. Lena was the next hurdle. Our relationship remained cordial but distant, our conversations limited to co-parenting logistics. When I told her about Daniel's request, her reaction was a mix of guilt and apprehension. She admitted that she had always feared this moment but never imagined it would come so soon. We debated the pros and cons, our discussion occasionally veering into arguments. Lena worried that telling Ethan would confuse him and disrupt his sense of stability. I countered that withholding the truth could cause even greater damage in the long run. Ultimately, we agreed that while the decision was mine to make, we needed to present a united front for Ethan's sake. After weeks of deliberation, I decided to tell Ethan about Daniel. The conversation was one of the most difficult of my life. I waited until a quiet Sunday afternoon, choosing a moment when we were both relaxed and alone. Sitting across from him, I explained that I had something important to share. Ethan listened intently as I spoke, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. I told him about the DNA test, framing it as a discovery about his unique story rather than a betrayal. I explained that while I wasn't his biological father, it didn't change how much I loved him or the bond we shared. When I mentioned Daniel, I emphasized that he was just someone who cared about him and wanted to meet him someday if Ethan felt comfortable. To my surprise, Ethan took the news better than I expected. He had questions, of course, but they were simple and innocent. "Does this mean you're not my real dad?" he asked. My heart ached as I reassured him that being a dad was about more than biology, that my love for him would never change. When Ethan expressed interest in meeting Daniel, I arranged a casual introduction. We chose a public park where Ethan felt safe and comfortable, and I made it clear to Daniel that the meeting was strictly on Ethan's terms. As we approached the park that day, I felt a mix of anxiety and protectiveness. This was a moment that could shape Ethan's understanding of himself and his place in the world. Daniel was waiting on a bench near the playground, his demeanor calm but visibly nervous. When Ethan spotted him, he hesitated for a moment before walking over. I stayed close by, ready to intervene if necessary, but the interaction unfolded naturally. Daniel knelt to Ethan's level, introducing himself with a warmth that seemed genuine. They talked about simple things, school, favorite games, and Ethan's love for soccer. Watching them interact was bittersweet. On one hand, I felt a pang of jealousy, a reminder of the bond they shared through blood. On the other, I saw a man who genuinely cared for Ethan and respected the boundaries we had set. By the end of the meeting, Ethan seemed at ease, his initial shyness replaced by curiosity. In the weeks that followed, we began to navigate the complexities of this new dynamic. Daniel didn't push for more time with Ethan, instead waiting for him to express interest in further interactions. Lena and I worked hard to ensure that Ethan's life remained stable, maintaining our routines and emphasizing the love and support he had from both of us. To my surprise, having Daniel in the picture wasn't as disruptive as I'd feared. He was careful not to overstep, respecting my role as Ethan's father while finding small ways to connect with him. It wasn't an easy adjustment, but it was one that felt necessary for Ethan's sake. Amidst this period of adjustment, I stumbled upon a letter Lena had written but never sent. It was addressed to me, and the words inside were raw and unfiltered. She confessed that she had known Ethan might not be mine but had chosen to bury the truth out of fear. She wrote about the guilt that had consumed her and how much she regretted the choices that had led to our separation. Reading her words stirred a mix of emotions. I felt anger at her continued deception but also a strange sense of closure. Lena's letter didn't change the past, but it gave me a clearer understanding of her struggles and the reasons behind her actions. It also reinforced my belief that I had made the right decision by prioritizing honesty and transparency with Ethan. As I reflected on everything that had transpired, I realized how far I had come. The pain of Lena's betrayal and the chaos that followed had tested me in ways I never imagined, but it had also taught me about resilience and the importance of putting Ethan's needs above all else. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I felt equipped to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Life, with all its unexpected twists and turns, had a way of teaching us lessons we didn't know we needed. And as I watched Ethan play in the yard, his laughter filling the air, I knew that no matter what, we would be okay. Time has a way of softening the sharpest edges, but it doesn't erase them. The months following Ethan's meeting with Daniel were a period of adjustment for all of us. I found myself juggling roles I never expected. Father, co-parent, and, in some ways, mediator between Ethan and the man who had unknowingly shaped his existence. Through it all, I kept asking myself the same question. Was I doing the right thing? Ethan, blissfully adaptable as children often are, took to the new arrangement with surprising ease. Daniel's involvement remained minimal, and we carefully managed the frequency and nature of their interactions. These meetings were light and simple. A trip to the park, a soccer game, or a shared lunch. Ethan referred to Daniel by his first name, which was a deliberate choice. He was never Dad. Not in the way that mattered. Yet, as time passed, I noticed subtle changes in Ethan. He asked more questions about family, heritage, and the concept of identity. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked why I had decided to tell him about Daniel. The question caught me off guard, but I answered as honestly as I could. Because the truth matters, I said, and because I wanted you to know how special you are, to all of us. Ethan seemed content with that answer, but it left me reflecting on the choices I had made and the ones still to come. Just as life seemed to be settling into a new normal, a phone call from Lena shattered the illusion of stability. Her voice was frantic, tinged with panic. She had received a letter from Daniel's attorney, requesting formal visitation rights. The idea of a legal battle had always loomed in the back of my mind, but hearing it spoken aloud brought a new wave of dread. Lena and I met the next day to discuss the situation. For the first time in a long while, we were on the same side. We agreed that while Daniel had a right to know Ethan, it was crucial to protect our son's well-being above all else. We consulted a lawyer together, determined to set clear boundaries and ensure that Daniel's involvement remained supportive rather than disruptive. The legal process was grueling, filled with tense negotiations and moments of doubt. Daniel's intentions seemed genuine, but his persistence raised questions about how far he was willing to go. Our lawyer helped us craft a visitation agreement that prioritized Ethan's stability, limiting Daniel's role to periodic, supervised visits. It was a compromise that no one was entirely happy with, but it was one we could all live with. Amidst the legal proceedings, an unexpected revelation came to light. During a routine background check conducted by our lawyer, we discovered that Daniel had another child from a previous relationship. This child, a boy around Ethan's age, had been largely estranged from Daniel due to his history of absenteeism and a contentious breakup with the boy's mother. The news sent shockwaves through me. How could someone so adamant about being part of Ethan's life have failed another child so profoundly? When I confronted Daniel about it, his response was a mixture of regret and justification. He claimed that his past mistakes had taught him the value of family and that he was determined not to repeat them with Ethan. While his words carried a ring of sincerity, they also felt like an excuse, a way to absolve himself of the consequences of his actions. The revelation about Daniel's past forced me to reevaluate everything. It was no longer just about Ethan. It was about the kind of influence Daniel would have on him and whether his presence would ultimately be a source of support or confusion. I began to see that while honesty was important, so was discretion. Not every truth needed to be acted upon, and not every relationship was worth pursuing. I sat down with Ethan one evening, ready to have another honest conversation. I explained that while Daniel cared about him, it was okay to set boundaries. I reassured him that he had the right to choose how much involvement he wanted with Daniel and that whatever he decided, I would support him unconditionally. Ethan nodded, his maturity surprising me once again. "I just want things to stay the way they are," he said quietly. "I like our life." His words were a relief, but they also underscored the weight of the choices I'd made. In trying to give Ethan the best possible future, I had created a new reality for him, one that was both a burden and a gift. In the end, we settled into a delicate balance. Daniel's visits became less frequent, a mutual understanding that allowed us to preserve the stability Ethan cherished. Lena and I continued to co-parent effectively, our shared commitment to Ethan's happiness overriding the tensions of our past. Over time, the bitterness between us faded, replaced by a cautious respect. As for me, I found peace in the simple moments. Watching Ethan play soccer, helping him with school projects, and hearing him laugh at my terrible jokes. My love for him was deeper than ever, forged in the crucible of everything we had endured together. Looking back, I've come to realize that life rarely unfolds the way we expect. The DNA test that upended my world also became the catalyst for profound growth and understanding. It forced me to confront truths I'd never imagined and to make choices that redefined what it meant to be a father, a partner, and a man. Ethan's journey is far from over, and neither is mine. But as I watch him grow, I know that we've built something strong and enduring. Love, after all, isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, day after day, and choosing to stay, even when the road is hard and the answers aren't clear. And that, I think, is the greatest lesson of all.